Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros and this is Insane in the Endgame, and today I'm going to talk about the masters of the Endgame, the people who knew how to do the best of the best. They knew how to get the smallest advantage and then bring it on home from there. So what you saw in Caleb Denby's sessions, how to survive difficult endgames, this time you're going to learn how to win them. Alright, so let's jump on in with this game between Ulf Andersson and Sunye Neto. It is going to be kind of the theme of the day. It is a Catalan variation. We're going to fast forward in the middle game part, and we are going to stop over here just for a moment. So this is a typical Catalan position, with white having a safe king, but black having solid development as well, and is also just a single move away from castling. Now, it's not that Andersson is winning, or even better for that matter. He is going to slowly squeeze that little advantage that looks so minuscule. It's knight d2, knight takes c5, rook c1, castles. So before we kind of make any sort of progress here, we've got to take a look at the strongest pieces for black. Now, one of the strongest pieces that black has is this bishop on b7, which is neutralizing white's bishop on g2, sort of Ghostbusters style, making sure it is trapped over there. So here in this case, we will have to come up with a plan to neutralize that pressure. So I would advise you to take a little bit of a look here and a little bit of a think, because Ulf Andersson's next move is crucial for his strategy. So note that this bishop is pretty strong there, but apart from that bishop being very strong, we have ways to go against it. So at first blink, it looks that this pressure on our queen is annoying, but Andersson does not really believe so. Actually, he does not even care. Goes knight e1 and says, yes, you may have a jump in the future, but I will just move my queen away. Meanwhile, knight e1 activates this bishop, and in case of any knight jumps, the bishop will be under some pressure. Rook fd8, queen b1, just moving away from these dangerous threats and jumps. Rook c7. And just by looking at the position, you can tell that Andersson isn't even nursing an advantage right now. Black has two beautiful knights in the center. But this is the moment you have to think outside the box and realize how Andersson can improve on his pieces. This is the second step we got to find out. What would be a perfect way of trying to untangle as white in this position? Keep into consideration that as soon as we can get the rook queen out, white will have some extra space. So even though visually this does look very appalling for white, we can just like spring out of there once we get rid of black's best pieces. So the first logical idea would be to go and play knight d3, but knight d3 would run into ideas such as takes, queen takes, and knight f4, hitting both the bishop and the queen on d3, which looks too dangerous, and Andersson does decide to avoid that, and instead chooses the move knight to e4. The point is, this knight itself was sort of loose, undefended, and a potential weakness in the position, so he decides to go there, trade it off for a knight that was already dominating. Rook c8, knight takes c5, rook takes c5, rook takes c5, rook takes c5. So black is by no means worse just yet, but white did improve on the situation by trading. Now this is somewhat unique if you think about it, because most of the cases trades do not lead to advantages. But in this case, it actually to Ulf Andersson's benefit, as the legend, that is Ulf Andersson, knows that in the long run, it's black who has to fear for the endgame. So we see that the rook and queen is all stuck on a1 and b1. So he quickly brings the queen to d1. Now, as there have been rook trades on the c file, you have no threats on the queen anymore, and the queen is comfortable back in its initial squares. Rook c4. So now here comes the big question for us. Which square will be useful or in fact pivotal for us to grab the advantage as Ulf Andersson? So far black is doing fine. Black controls the d5 square and also has all the entry squares under control. What would be a logical way? And a way that has been used by Andersson so far. Trading. Of course, Ulf Andersson goes rook c1. This rook anyways wasn't doing anything spectacular. It is much better off traded, especially versus a rook which was kind of threatening to invade, and queen c7 was on the cards as well. So rook takes c1, queen takes c1. Now this didn't answer our big question, which square will be critical. There is one critical square in this position which is essential for a white advantage. Which square could that be? So notice that white just traded off any pieces that were in the way and kept the rest that can be useful in the endgame. And the answer is, it's the c5 square. So if the knight can hop on to c5, not only we would get a wonderful piece on that square, but also we would target the bishop and the pawn on a6. So even though this position seems very tepid from a first look, black has to deal with a weak queen side, while white has no weaknesses whatsoever. Black will also have to deal with that king weakness on g8. So knight b6, queen takes b7, bishop takes b7, that is, queen takes b7. So chess is not just about achieving your own goals, but about restricting your opponent's play. And Ulf's next move actually is more restrictive in nature than actually going for his own plans. And that actually is a sign of a true champion. True champions usually make sure the opponent doesn't really have a good plan anymore, and then they continue on with their own ideas. So here Ulf played queen c5. a very, very strong move. If black would face knight d3, potentially black could reorganize with knight d5 and just consolidate. But with queen c5, it's actually making sure there are no queen d5 moves, because you always have to look out for queen takes b6 ideas. Knight d5, and we do transpose knight d3, and you can feel the difference. White's knight is heading and is closer to the a pawn, while this queen is sort of relegated to defend the b and a pawns, which is of a detriment. Also, in the long run, this king might be a little bit closer than its counterpart, which still has to deal with some back rank issues. And that's actually a little bit of a benefit of the Catalan. You already have a luft, so any check you'd get, there is a king g2 move, and the king could run away. Queen c7, and Sunye Neto, who's a grandmaster himself, thinks that a queen trade should definitely lead to a draw. But is that really the case? Well, the answer is no. It's not a draw. And in fact, Ulf is just happy to play e4 here. Now, black is forced to trade. Knight can't move, otherwise you lose the queen. So queen takes, knight takes. If knight b4, white can just go a3, then pick up the a pawn, and then you see how glorious this knight is on that c5 square. It not only attacks the a pawn, it also takes away this invading square from the black knight. And after knight c6, you just win a pawn on a6, and white is just completely winning with an extra pawn. So here, Neto had to go knight c7, but this is what we call domination. The knight on c5 is completely dominating the c7 one. Now, domination does not necessarily equal a winning position. So Ulf Andersson will still have to do and put in some work to win it. He has this control over the knight. There are some targets on the queen side, but in order to win, and any endgame, and especially this one, you need a second weakness. So this was the first one on the queen side, but need another one. So the question is, where can we find that other weakness? Which side or where? Now, apart from finding weaknesses, you also have to keep in mind your opponent's plans. As I said, part of your goal in chess is to restrict your opponent's play and then follow up with your own. So Andersson's next move isn't just about facilitating his own plans. So f4 is not just about bringing the king in, but it's also about stopping this eventual plan of king f8, king e7, king d6 with a potential e5 move, just keeping that king locked on in. So if let's say here, 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 white may just go e5, making sure the king is boxed in, and then white can continue on with his plans. He could try to go this way, although eventually there might be an a5 move, or go the g4, king e4, f5 way, trying to pressure the e pawn and creating an extra passer on the king side. And that combined with these weaknesses could prove decisive. Now, Sunye understood this idea, went f6 himself, notes that he can just wait idly, because in that case, he's just going to get smothered. King f7, king f2, king f7, b4. Again, in the same idea. First off, trying to restrict, and this time making sure the knight cannot hop around anymore, nor does black have the move a5. Now a5, if you play it now, it's still not necessarily a great move for black, because in that case white can go knight b7, a4, and then this king can do a little bit of a home run, and once it reaches the c5 or b6 square, it is technically winning for white, because if the b pawn falls, so does the game get lost. But after king f2, king f7, b4 fixes this pawn on a6 eternally. The same thing with the the c7 knight. That knight will always have to guard that a6 square. So that sort of means we're technically in a pawn endgame from black's perspective. e5, king f3. And this is not your usual opposition, but it is, by the way, considered an opposition. This is what we call a distant opposition between the two kings. g6. And this is probably the most important moment. Here, Andersson will have to decide which direction he wants to go to. Is he trying to come up with a plan on the queen side? Is he continuing on the king side? And if he does, is he trying to outplay his opponent or try to a more direct approach? So let's try to think about that for a minute. So one hint in these type of positions is checking out your opponent's moves. What can Sunye Neto do in this position? Well, the knight can't move, as we said before. It's stalemated on c7. It is lorded by our knight on c5. So the only things that Sunye could do is either rotate the king back and forth or start moving these h, g, and f pawns. Those are the moves that are possible for black. Now, once we get into an endgame position, it is all about the little nuances and whether we can out-tempo our opponents. And Andersson decides, I am willing to go for the endgame. I have many reservoir moves. So he goes king g4 and sets up this threat of king g5. If you don't react, go king e7. White is just going to go king g5, and once I invade that square, you will be overloaded. Let's say you go try to play this passively. There is knight d7. You're losing the e5 pawn, and you lose the game as well. Your king and knight is just way too passive to get enough counterplay. But if you go king f6, you run into knight d7 check. If the king goes to e6, knight f8 check, and you lose the pawn. So even though it looks like a simple position, defending this with black is not at all trivial. You can't just block me with king f6. You can't just ignore me with king e7 because I run on in. Same with king g7. I go knight d7 and I immediately win the e pawn as the king can't cross on over there. So the only move that Sunye considered the best is h6, sort of creating a wall of pawns, saying that there will be no passerang. But this turned out to be flawed. White can break through. So oftentimes it's not necessarily about your own moves, but about potential plans and attacks your opponents can do. Here it's important to understand that Sunye is almost in a Sutswang situation where he can't really maneuver too much. So Ulf's next move was h4. He's saying that if I get h5 in there, if I could trade that, this will lead to an advantage for me because then I'll get access to the f5 square, which conversely will give me the e-pawn and the game. So if you go king g7, I go h5, and I'm just coming too close. g5, that just means success for white. I'm just walking on in, picking up the pawn, and it's game over. If you take, I can take here, I can start rolling with my pawn, get the opposition. Whichever way you go, I can come on in there, or just simply pick up the pawn that way. So Sunye was forced to play h5. King g5, a little risky. It's almost checkmate, but thankfully we've got our hero of the game, the knight on c5, to stop that checkmate. Take it and just take all those pawns on g6 and h5. King g7, g4. Trade them all. Takes, king, king f6. Now, even in this case, extra little moves are crucial. So I said earlier, it feels like a king and pawn endgame, but in fact it's still with knights. So sometimes black can think about giving up a pawn just for active play. So Ulf doesn't even go h5 first, he goes a3, because black, believe it or not, doesn't have anything else apart from a king move. The knight is still stuck there, and you still have to guard this idea of knight d7 attacking the e-pawn. So you can't just go king g7, same idea of knight d7, I'm taking the e-pawn. King f7, king g5, king g7. And once the king is gone and away, white goes knight d7 and he's winning the e-pawn. Check. King g4, knight d4. And still props for Sunye Neto, Ulf Andersson's opponent. Tries to activate the knight because he knows that in an endgame, your best chance is piece activity. Knight takes e5, knight c2. And seemingly this does not look great for Ulf. However, Andersson knows the best defense is to counterattack. So he goes knight d7, knight takes a3, knight c5. He gives away the a-pawn, but says, I'm going to win your a-pawn as well, and I've got that extra pawn to work with. And with the pawns being on both sides and both ends of the board, it's much more difficult for Sunye to actually organize a successful defense. Knight takes a6, king f3, king f4, king e3, knight e1. And again, Sunye is not giving up. So even though he's not going to succeed in this game, his level of tenacity does match the tenacity that you see in the current top players. They're also very tenacious. And this is something well worth taking from these legendary players. So again, got to wonder, should we just try to over-defend the E and H pawns, or look for something more active? So here Ulf actually decides to go e5. You could try to go king f4, and that's a different kind of strategy, saying I'm going to over defend all of these pieces. However, then you can't really base your ideas on piece activity. When Andersson decides to go e5, he's saying I am willing to part with this pawn, but for an exchange, I am going to have very, very good piece play myself, with certain threats of promoting myself. So black doesn't even want part of that. King f7, king e4, knight g2, knight c7, takes, knight takes b5. And with the pawn just being so far away from that square, the king being too close, and these pawns fairly advanced, black is just lost. Knight f5, knight d4. And again, a tendency why you should know your basic pawn endgames. A trade would lose immediately, because at the end of the day, you can't capture either of those pawns because the other one would just promote. So knight d4, Andersson is happy to offer this idea for Sunye. Knight e7, b5, king d5 here, and king c5. And you always wonder, so is the king, knight, and pawn endgame the same as a king and pawn endgame? No, it's not the same. The knight will be successful enough to stop this g pawn from promoting, while this knight is helpless against the b pawn running down the board. And that kind of shows that domination can often win you a chess game, especially deep down in these endgames. So the second game I want to show you guys is the game between Sam Reshevsky and Herman Pilnik. It is exactly the same opening, leading to these type of endgames. Rook c8, a4, takes, knight c3, c5. And at first look, it again looks very tepid, solid, and not at all awe-inspiring. However, compared to the previous game by Ulf Andersson, white has more targets than before. So the first things first, you always have to identify your future weaknesses you're going to latch onto. So let's try to identify that first. Then we can continue on. Reshevsky, of course, decided to take on d5. Bishop takes d5. And now he wondered, of course, if you take on e6 now, that wouldn't be winning. There is bishop takes f3, bishop takes and c takes, and black is by no means any worse. Black will be building a center with e5 and will be having a great position. So that is not the move that Reshevsky played here. So first step, identify weaknesses. Second step, go after them. And actually this kind of shows that even though Fischer got most of the limelight towards the 70s for understandable reasons, Reshevsky was a master of this game, especially a big master of endgames. He knew when to put the pressure and how to put the pressure correctly. And Reshevsky's next move, rook f c1, even though does not strike maybe the average people spectacular, it is very, very useful of a move. It puts pressure on the two big weaknesses that Pilnik has, the a6 pawn and the c5 pawn. First off, he is trying to put pressure there, and once there is a little bit of a trade there, he can divert his attention to the a6 one. Knight takes d4. Now, if they would take on f3, we take back, c takes, queen takes d4, and with pawns on both sides and both ends of the board, this is a little bit better for white because the bishop will be much more comfortable attacking that a pawn. In fact, sometimes could go e3, bishop e2. So let's say knight b8. There is a potential idea of going e3, bishop e2, and go after the a pawn. But Pilnik decided to take on d4. Knight takes d4. Takes, king takes. And again, this is a little bit different from the Michal Tal type of chess. Here you're accumulating the smallest of advantages possible and try to win nevertheless. So there are a couple of things that we improved upon since the position we looked at. There is still this a6 weakness. Also look at this knight on d4. It just hopped into that center square, and we are about to target the c6 square. If the knight can hop over there, white will get a beautiful bind on Pilnik. So let's say if black goes here, for one, rook c7 is very strong, but even if you don't feel like going in there immediately, after knight c6, black will be in full control, as all of these pieces are going down there. In fact, knight e7 would be winning on the spot. So accumulating small advantages can actually win you a game much quicker than you think it would. Knight b8. Knight b8 is a sad move, and it shows that Reshevsky's advantage is substantial. Misplaces this knight intentionally just to stop knight c6 ideas, which wouldn't really work due to queen b7 and that pin on the king. So if you go here, queen b7, you're pinned and you're actually losing. And if you remember the first lesson from the Ulf Andersson Neto game, you can use the same logic and technique in this Reshevsky game. You know your opponent's threats, restrict the idea. If you can restrict it, you are halfway there. So we already kind of suspect that black would love to get the queen to b7 and then maybe in a bright future play e5. I'm a little bit hesitant with the e5 pawn move because it would create a target on e5, as that pawn would not have this support by the f7 pawn. Kind of shows that queen b7 is a plan. Therefore, Reshevsky decides to play queen b3 himself, just denying that square from Pilnik. Now, let's just take a look around what Sam Reshevsky has accomplished. There is still a weakness on a6. That knight is very, very bad on b8. We don't have an immediate control over the c6 square, but our knight is just much better than yours. I mean, our knight is just much better than our opponent's. Much, much better. So there's a weakness, a bad knight, and in general, we're the one controlling the situation. They can't even check us. Rook c d8. Now, rook c d8 is an interesting choice by Pilnik. Usually when you're kind of lacking space, you'd be thinking of trading. So maybe it would have been, in hindsight, better to trade on c1. But he goes rook d8. And whenever you're trying to milk advantages like this, you've got to remember that one little slip can let the advantage go. For example, if you go knight f3, then black can slowly try to consolidate with going rook d6 and maybe eventual either knight d7 or knight c6. So Reshevsky is staunch on leaving that knight on d4, just making sure that c6 square is still under his control. Rook d7. Just trying to double up, somewhat of a passive move, but it doesn't make our lives easier. That's why we still need to come up with a plan. Obviously, we can't really play on the king side. Pilnik is way too solid there. And Reshevsky's next move, by the way, is reminiscent of a boxing style. Rook a5. The point being, it's trying to push back. Black fixing the target, fixing the weakness, and then piling upon it. Same in boxing. You make sure that you get your opponent in a tough spot and you try to go on from there. Rook a5. And in fact, this has a dual purpose. Not only does it press on the a-pawn, but it sort of dissuades Pilnik from ever playing e5, because anytime you do that, White would be able to counterattack immediately. Rook b7, queen a3. And queen a3 sort of shows that we're not in here to win it in a tactical fight. We're here to win the long grind. So let's say if you take on a3, pawn takes, like White does not have the luxury to take it with the rook, this would be a drawn endgame. Even if we win the a6 pawn, it would just even out. So we've got to play and take with the b pawn, but our threats will be quite strong after knight c6, because even if they trade, there'll always be an a6 pawn weakness. And rook c8 does not really work due to this idea of knight d7 check, and then you lose the rook and the knight is even on b8. So queen a3, queen b4. A cheeky response by Pilnik, but not a terribly dangerous one. So Reshevsky's next move is more about consolidating than anything else. He goes rook c2. He's not really afraid of trades. He's okay with that. But now, by the way, if takes, we might actually consider to take with the rook, because eventually we could play b3, as our knight will be right there to guard the b pawn, while this a pawn is going to be under constant pressure. So rook c2, g6. And it is time for us to come up with a new game plan. So far, so good. We consolidated. We have a very, very strong knight on d4. We have pressure on the a pawn. We've got this pawn all guarded. But now we have to look for a new plan. That is a mighty knight there. So apart from the a-pawn, in the long term, actually Black has this knight as some sort of a target. So Reshevsky decides to actually leave the a-pawn alone and look for another plan, and that is of invading the 8th rank, because then that b8 knight will become a nuisance. Knight d7. And here Reshevsky does the curious thing of repeating. Now, there's always a talk why super grandmasters ever repeat. Well, it has to do with the fact of the time controls. That you're often trying to mark time and get closer to the magical number of 40. because that was traditionally the time control time. So if you got to move 40, you will get additional time to use for the later part of the game. So it makes sense for Reshevsky to repeat one and then come up with a new plan. So he of course does not want to repeat. Goes rook a4. He doesn't mind the trade, but Pilnik actually doesn't want anything to do with that. In b6, and now he goes rook c4. No more threats of trading, and eventually now rook c8 does become a threat. Now remember this, knight is sort of still stuck. If you ever move that knight, you are just inviting white to get the knight to c6, which puts immense positional pressure on Pilnik's position. This might be very close to losing already. Talking about that, like a random move of h5, white can go rook b4. And believe it or not, the queen is trapped. You can't go to those squares. If you go queen c7, there's knight e7 check, and you lose the queen over there. So here Pilnik started to get desperate for a good reason. White is about to crash through. So he went for e5. Knight f3. And it's very admirable how Reshevsky plays this whole game coolly, calmly, and collectedly, not really rushing the situation, saying Pilnik is the one under pressure. It's Pilnik who has to make tough decisions. I'm just going to wait for the right moment. And here, Pilnik played a move that would make some certain Ben cringe. Played f6. And the reason f6 is not a good move, and I of course agree with Ben, it leaves the king awfully exposed on g8, and there are no longer any guardian pawns in front of the king. So yes, black managed to gain some space, but if Sam Reshevsky manages to invade the position, that invasion is going to get decisive. And it all has to do with this f6 move. Rook c8. Reshevsky is not waiting no longer. If you would take, it's checkmate. Checkmate on f8. Rook c8, queen b4. And there has been a lot of changes since the middle game / endgame position we looked at. White had a little bit of pressure on the a-pawn, but no real attacks on the king. But by now, black has overextended, created plenty of targets. So Reshevsky wants no business with a queen trade. So goes queen d3. Not really falling for e4, which visually looks like a win. So there's queen d5 check, and the knight will just hop away. Let's say rook f7, knight d4, and this is that typical position that looks even because the pawn count is even, but in reality is just completely lost for Pilnik because black's king is just awfully exposed while arcing on g2 is straight up chillin'. So queen d3, rook f7, e4. And e4 is again that typical Reshevsky style, slowly but surely moving forward, not trying to rush the win. That is of course better. So he's not looking for a winning blow just yet. Queen b7. So this is the moment you do have to look around. Pilnik is about to smoke out the rook on c8, and we can't really go to c7 because that's guarded by the queen and rook, and it seemingly is no way to break through that case. So this is probably the most important technical part of the game, where Reshevsky is going to decide it in his favor. So it is white to move and take control of the situation. So if you don't have any entry squares on the 8th or the 7th, well, chess is about problem solving. Create an entry square for yourself. Rook takes f8 check. Rook takes f8, queen d6. And queen d6 is an all-star move. Doesn't want to just take any file. Like, you could try to go in there with queen c7. But no, Reshevsky wants more. Reshevsky wants domination, wants to make sure that knight doesn't have any way out. You go knight d7, bam, it already loses. The queen and knight is under attack, and you're going to lose one of them. You can go to c6, and the next move is rook c7. Followed by queen e7, and with the tractor on c7 and the queen all lined up, it is just game over. So you really don't have time to take on e4, even though that looks juicy because of this idea of rook c7 and an eventual queen e7, which is just checkmating. So in desperation, Pilnik went for queen d7, and obviously in this case, we don't want to trade queens. Goes queen b6. And you might be wondering, okay, you told me about these pawn weaknesses, but why does that matter? Well, black would love to trade off this c-rook, but that would lose on the spot due to the fact that there's rook takes and queen takes f6. Now you're going to lose the e-pawn, and you're going to get checkmated as well. So because of these pawn weakenings, black is just lost on the spot and can't do the strategically sound idea of rook c8. Queen f7, which is a sad concession. Now Reshevsky goes rook c7, and in comes the rook and queen. Queen e8, of course, if you go knight d7, then white can take on a6. So queen e8, queen b7, and now with the rook planning to invade the king and setting up mate. So if black would just ignore that, do some sort of a desperado, that would be mate in 3. Again, talking about domination. So Pilnik played rook f7, just making one less desperado, but of course, after rook takes f7, queen takes f7, queen takes b8, he's losing a piece, and he resigned. So these were the games I wanted to show how you can pile a little bit of pressure at a time. Ulf Andersson style, Reshevsky style. Go step by step, and eventually they'll break. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye.